In the Swiss Alps, the village of Andermatt is being given a new life. Once a thriving spa, then a military garrison, it fell on hard times when the soldiers moved out. It's been saved by an Egyptian billionaire who saw its potential as a resort and turned to the Swiss-British architect Christina Seilern to help him.
I find it incredible that an Egyptian is the one that reconnected me to Switzerland, because I grew up there, I was born there.
From first sketches through worked-up drawings to models, Christina Seilern and her team in London imagined and then created a concert hall that now attracts world-class artists to Andermatt.
Acoustically, you design for the orchestra because they, for one, understand it better than anybody else. A member of the public will not have the same ear or understanding as a musician, and they will ultimately determine whether a hall is good or not.
Andermatt, once the crossroads of Switzerland, now a village busy reinventing itself and using architecture to do it. In the new concert hall, fashioned inside a redundant bunker once planned for conferences but never actually used, they're rehearsing for a series of concerts marking the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth. And the architect Christina Seilern is here to meet acoustic engineers to find out how her latest creation, opened less than a year earlier, is performing. In some senses, this is home. She was born in Switzerland to an Austrian father and German mother and grew up here and didn't learn English until she was 14. And even though a young Christina Seilern was seduced by New York, then by London and Paris, and even though she's famously said, "I belong everywhere and I belong nowhere," this global architect was a logical choice to meet the brief set by the Egyptian developer Sami Sawiris, who was determined to revive Andermatt.
There was an existing conference room attached to the Radisson Blu Hotel, which was under construction. And the client first asked me whether I knew an acoustician who could turn this into a concert hall, and I said, yes, I do, but I'll give you the name if I get the job. and then it was a question of really turning this box into a proper concert hall. The brief initially was more to decorate a box and then make it sort of acoustically viable. And that would have not fulfilled the brief of actually having important orchestras coming. Orchestras like the Berliner or maestros like Barenboim would have not happened had we kept this box. So then came along the journey of transforming this box into a concert hall. And that went through a series of steps, baby steps, in order to allow the client to swallow that pill that actually quite a bit needed to be done in order to turn it into a concert hall.
Two things mark out this project. First, the space was a given. It existed. That was the first challenge. Secondly, Swiss planning laws and policies are notoriously strict. Challenge number two for Christina Seilern: if the building couldn't go out, how far could it go up?
The very first sketch that I did, I was actually in hospital in Zurich. I just had an operation, and I did this sketch because it was such an odd site. It was behind a hotel, in between another one. It wasn't in the main plaza. Usually you put the culture in the main square of a village, and that wasn't. It was kind of in the back street. So it needed something, and we also wanted that pedestrian street to have something extraordinary, something that you would discover, that you wouldn't really imagine. So just by raising the roof, one is we most importantly got the volume acoustically that we needed in order to be able to bring some important music in that space. But it also allowed natural light into the space, and it allowed passers-by to look into the space while a concert is going on. And I think that's, for me, is the most successful thing, is that you are sitting in a concert hall, and we were listening to a concert, and there were a group of children, and they literally stuck their nose onto the glass looking at us, and that this interaction is wonderful. Also, in the winter, you are looking literally at the slopes. So you're sitting in a concert hall and you see the skiers coming down the mountain. So bringing the mountains into this concert hall was very important. By raising the roof, we not only got natural light into the space, and we got the acoustic volume that we required, but there is something about sitting in a space and you can hear its size. So if you go into a cathedral and you make a noise without closing your eyes, you will know it's a large space. In the same manner that when you're in a small confined space and you make a noise, you know you're in a small space without actually seeing. So there is this element of seeing and hearing through eyes and ears. And I think that if you sit in a space where you have a longer perspective and you see out into a larger space, you will also hear bigger. That's my theory. Now, I don't know if it's scientifically proven, but I feel that if you are in a space and you can see the perspective of the mountains behind and there's this big music going on, it will go together much better than if you're in a constricted space. We had very little time to do it, and we weren't allowed to bring in new foundations, new piling. There was a very restricted budget, and also there were planning restrictions. So we had to take all of these restrictions and see how far we could push it. But actually they really helped, because what we did in the end is we grew the building. So we added what I call the backpack, which is the balcony. And what we did is we cantilevered that off the roof. So the roof is supported by an existing structure. Everything is supported by existing foundations. We couldn't add any foundations, but we managed to sort of hang things onto the existing foundation and the existing structure to increase this volume. And then we essentially used steel. We have these, what I call the chopstick columns that don't go straight. So nothing is straight in this building. The inside of the ceilings are all an origami shape. So because nothing is straight, we decided the columns shouldn't be straight. Even the glass angles, if you look at them very carefully, you realize that they're not quite straight, they're also angled. So everything is a little bit as if it's moving, a little bit not static like music.
There were other considerations. The concert hall had to be able to accommodate a full symphony orchestra, 75 musicians, an audience of over 600, and, because of its position in Andermatt, make a contribution to the public realm. But crucially, it had to work, and the technicalities of the acoustics inside the hall and the noise outside, a subject on which the Swiss planners have strong views, became all-consuming.
Doing a concert hall is so technical. There's so many things to think of in terms of fire, acoustics, obviously, etc. So there are so many, the research into what can be done and how you do it is every time a bespoke element. So it's not that you buy a window off the shelf and you put it in, or you don't buy a ceiling off the shelf and you put it in. Everything is designed specifically for those acoustics, those fire requirements, etc. So for example, for the glass, the noise reduction in Switzerland are very stringent, and so we were less worried about noise coming into the concert hall during a concert as opposed to noise coming out of the concert hall during a concert, or more importantly if they had amplified music, because it would disturb the neighbors. And so there were very high requirements on the glass, and initially we found a solution of doing a triple glazed facade, which was very untransparent, very complicated, lots of joints, lots of details in terms of facade cleaning impossible. And then we worked with a glazing manufacturer and gave them the specs at different decibels, how it had to react the glass. And we managed to find a triple glazing that actually fitted the acoustics, fitted the environmental constraints. Through this complexity of what you're trying to achieve, which is what we're trying to achieve, is simplicity. The other thing which is extraordinary is everything is very expensive there. The minimum wage is extraordinarily high, and they have this real understanding of spreading the wealth. And so that's wonderful, because it just means that the Swiss will do every job and no job, you know, to be a carpenter is considered fantastic, and so there is this sort of sense of not just the bankers making a lot of money, but that everybody essentially shares from the wealth of the country. And you can see that, because then it comes out in the quality of the work. It comes out in the wanting to not compromise. It really pushes you to take the research a little bit further than what you're used to, and that's the exciting part of it. This sense of getting it absolutely right is very strong there. And the other thing is that the trades have existed for generations. So if you look at the woodwork there, it's extraordinary, because it's been father and son and father and son and father and son. The knowledge in their craft is so superior. We as architects learn a lot from the builders and from the craftsmen there.
On performing spaces, Christina Seilern has Form, an arts centre for Wellington College in Berkshire in 2018. A cultural centre at El Gouna in Egypt, a town being created out of nothing by Sami Sawiris, the same man who rescued Andermatt. And Leicester's Curve Theatre, a building completed in what she calls her previous life, when she worked for the Uruguayan architect Rafael Vinoli, first in the United States and then in Britain, where she set up his London office. A lot has happened since then.
It starts extrapolating a plan, and the idea is really here for this.
Christina Seilern wanted to be a scientist, but came to the conclusion that it wasn't wild enough. She left Switzerland, where she grew up, and went to America to study architecture at Columbia University. And after Switzerland, the USA, first Boston, then New York, was a revelation.
Everything being so big and so fast, and so that had a huge impact. And also the people, the students who were there, they were all South American and from all over the world. And suddenly your friends were, I was traveling around South America most of the time because suddenly you had a whole group of friends who were from there. And it's sort of, so this nomadic, I used to think that if I know where I will be in 5 years' time, it's terrible. Now I've settled a bit. I have children, I have a husband, so I'm a bit more settled. But still, I like this working, and probably that's why we work abroad, because I love this going and exploring and working in other places. And not just visiting as a tourist. It's really about sort of inhabiting and working and interacting in a meaningful level with the people who live there.
All the time she was absorbing America's architectural influences. She fell in love with not only the art of architecture, but also what she calls its poetry. For her, one of the masters of the poetry of architecture was the Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen, whose work includes Dulles Airport in Washington, and the TWA Flight Center at New York's Idlewild Airport, now JFK, opened in 1961.
I guess the first architect I discovered, the first architecture class that I took at MIT, they asked me to draw the chapel. That was one of the assignments, take a building in MIT and draw it, and draw sections and elevation. And I didn't even know who he was at the time. I was 18, 19. So I started reading about him, and it was just, as a modernist, he was so poetic. And it wasn't just form follows function. There was this thing about designing with light, and that's something that I think about all the time. I've written about it, I've lectured about it. I call it light as a building material, as a concrete element. So this was the first time I discovered that or understood something like that. And the simplicity of the execution, but the power of the execution, I always found really touching.
Here, in her 20s in Manhattan, Christina Seilern found a job making models for Raphael Vinoli, who'd moved to the States in the 1970s. Later, as an architect herself, she worked day and night, literally, to keep up with Vinoli, a period in her life she now considers to be one of the most formative and most enjoyable.
New York gave me a work ethic like no other. You all say that in New York you work to live or you live to work. I don't really know which way around it is, but you get to the office. I used to get there at 7:30 and I would leave at 10 p.m., work every Sunday. And to me it was normal. We were doing something, I was given this chance of working on these extraordinary buildings at such a young age. And so therefore I wanted to go and work. It wasn't, oh God, I've got to do this. So it's the feeling that you were doing something that was so extraordinary and that was worth every second of your time was there. And that had a lot to do with Raphael too. That's his mentality. He works harder than anybody else. But it's sort of, we would do competitions, or even working on a normal project. I remember I would do an all-nighter every week, regularly. Every week we would do an all-nighter, and that was a normal part, but we were so proud of what we were doing and at the speed at which we were producing. And it's also, when you're a young architect, the learning curve is so steep. So unless you put in the hours, you'll be stuck figuring out what you're doing. And I think I.M. Pei said, you're only an architect when you're 50.
Moving to London in 2005, Christina Seilern opened a UK office for Raphael Vinoli. She was 29. 20 Fenchurch Street, named the Walkie-Talkie by Londoners, is one of the projects from that time. But what she really wanted was to run her own practice.
You walk into a room and there's 10 lawyers and 16 consultants and 3 client reps, etc. So you've got this room full of suits, and you're presenting and talking, and everybody sort of has something to say about your project, and you're constantly defending it. And then suddenly I had a couple, and we were doing this house in this mad country, Zimbabwe, and we were sitting around the table with a glass of wine talking about it. And they kept laughing at me, saying, you're too professional, like relax, just relax a bit. And so I had this adjustment to do in terms of how to talk to the clients. But more importantly, what the adjustment I had to do was the scale, because you're dealing with a tower, right? You're dealing with 20 Fenchurch Street, and you're talking about a fin that's repeated 100,000 times, and the cost and the net to gross efficiency, etc., etc. And there I was talking to them about how they move around their closet and why. And it's something, this question of sort of little moves and how it affects the scale and how you design the building according to that was a language that I had lost with the larger projects.
The couple in whose house Christina Seilern found herself discussing plans over a glass of wine, a very different experience from all those corporate meetings about 20 Fenchurch Street, had asked her to design a house for them in Zimbabwe, on what must be one of the most spectacular locations in Africa, if not in the world. The house at Gotterdam won an award from the Royal Institute of British Architects. It would become her calling card, and it showed that she was not afraid to work in any country. Her projects take her from London to Dubai to Egypt, where she's designed a cultural centre at El Gouna, the town that Sami Sawiris is creating from scratch on the edge of the Red Sea. Here she's been influenced by traditional Egyptian architecture. But she's equally proud of the smaller scale, like this exquisite barn conversion in Oxfordshire, turned into a home and a gallery for a private art dealer. There was one other great advantage of leaving big corporate projects like 20 Fenchurch Street behind: the freedom to have a hand in everything, from massing through materials to detailing to the way a scheme flows. Many years ago, Christina Seilern spent a year at the Beaux-Arts in Paris, and she's never forgotten those drawing classes. For her, it all starts not on a computer, but on paper.
So a lot of times I'll start with a sketch as such, just to sort of get an idea of what we're trying to do. And then from there, we'll try to extrapolate what it does. So now I'm kind of taking this idea and I'm putting it in plan, and depending on what I've drawn, it starts extrapolating a plan. And the idea is really here for this building. This is a building that we designed in a competition, which we won, we're very happy about. But what it does is it gives you a sense of scale and depth, and once you start developing it in plan, you kind of see whether it works or it doesn't. So it's a constant repetition of plan and section. And then you see here, now there's a courtyard, and so once I start populating that, I can also see routes coming through, so I will create openings through the building. To me, these are people, and so you can see how. So when I start doing that, I go, well, okay, well, there's a natural entrance here, so something will happen in here, and then there's a natural sequence. So there, I was designing a hotel. It sort of seems that I'm starting to read a plan just from a massing, and the idea of this massing is that it was interacting in a place that had some kind of scale and architecture that was broken up. So we had a large building to do, but it was in an area where the scale of the architecture was very modest. And so how do you take this idea and break it up into volume and yet still create a coherent building that a developer would be happy to build rather than a whimsical building. If I look at sketchbooks, some of them are very, very rough and unsuccessful. And a lot of the times, and then some are really very rigid because I'm trying to solve a corner that has specific ideas. But sometimes it's sort of, you're trying to get to somewhere and it starts, some drawings don't work very well. And I find that if you find it so difficult to draw, the idea is too complicated. These very rough sketches first, and you then start coloring them. And you start building the idea, and as the idea becomes more prominent, then the sketch becomes easier to draw and better. So this is an idea that I've already pretty much developed in my head, and it's easier for me to draw it. When I'm starting at the beginning, it starts very, very rough, and then as the sketch goes on and we develop it, and then we develop it in CAD, and then we draw over it, I will draw over it. So there's a lot of drawings, which then the sketching on top of the CAD drawing is also very important. But there's a sense of scale that you find, you know, when you're on a CAD, when you're looking at your computer, you can zoom in and out very, very quickly, and you can, you know, just sort of be a worm and you can be a bird within 2 seconds, and to really understand this sense of scale is quite difficult. Whereas when you're drawing, the minute you put people in and trees and things like that, the scale is very apparent.
Designing a building is one thing, constructing it quite another. For her second project in Andermatt, the restaurant Gutsch, it meant prefabricating sections off-site and delivering them to the top of the mountain by helicopter. Andermatt, south of Lucerne alongside the Gotthard Pass, is a work in progress. It took an Egyptian developer, Sami Sawiris, to see its potential as a resort, and slowly all that a resort needs is being created. Luxury hotels, the concert hall, new cable car stations and ski runs. And a restaurant on a mountain, or rather 2 restaurants.
The placing of the building on site was incredibly challenging, and it moved quite a bit, quite a few times. But essentially what happened is that the building got shifted really to the edge, and it gave rise to this wonderful element, so that when you're standing here, you have this very, very vertical, monumental stone wall that comes out of the ground, and then these very light terraces that are supported by these sculptural columns below. So this idea of a stone structure that emerges from the ground upwards like a stone sculpture, just like if you look at mountains, you know, the stone tops, that was the analogy of that. It was based on a sculpture, and it was based on this notion of what we call in French the hameau, which is the place where the shepherd would bring his cows or his animals up the mountain and stay up there in the summer, and it's this repetition of the same kind of block. So this idea of the repetition of the same kind of block came from this idea of mountain structures.
How do you build a restaurant on the top of a mountain? With difficulty and in a hurry. At this altitude, the period without snow is small. Last year there was still snow on site in June.
And initially we had planned to do this in 3 seasons, and then the client asked us to, you know, compress it into 2 seasons only. So we built the foundations 1 season, then we left it, and then we built all the superstructure, everything, the roof, the windows and the interiors and the terraces all in 1 season, and that was incredibly tight. So we had to do a lot of prefabrication off-site so that everything could come up and be assembled as quickly as possible. And the management of the trades and everybody working together was obviously quite challenging. And then the knowledge of when you could start on site. And it was literally, okay, it's not snowing, come up. We also had to helicopter in some of the stuff at the end in order to meet the deadlines.
The restaurant on top of the world is something special. But it's the concert hall that's bringing world class to Andermatt. Daniel Barenboim has been here, performing Beethoven's piano sonatas to mark the 250th anniversary of the composer's birth. Few Swiss ski resorts can say that. On a flying visit to Andermatt, Christina Seilern is talking to the acousticians about the elliptical panels she's designed in an attempt to get the sound just right in her new concert hall. The musicians performing here in a Beethoven festival seem pleased.
They're the only critics at the end of the day. Of course you design for the experience and for the public, and so a lot of the concert halls that we do now, we actually put the people around the stage. I kind of move away from this shoebox idea, because I just find that, I mean, Barenboim once said to me in a meeting that music is not linear, and it just goes everywhere. And if you look at his hall in Berlin, the Divan Hall, the Pierre Boulez Saal, he's put the stage right in the middle and then has a donut of people around it. And so I find this theory absolutely valid. And so the experience of proximity to the musicians, this sort of intimacy with the musicians is very important. But ultimately, acoustically, you design for the orchestra because they, for one, understand it better than anybody else. A member of the public will not have the same ear or understanding as a musician, and they will ultimately determine whether a hall is good or not. I mean, nowadays when we work with acousticians, some acousticians rely enormously on their 3D programs of analysis, and some actually don't. You pretty much understand today how acoustics work in a way that you didn't 100 or 150 years ago. So there's no excuse for creating something that is acoustically poor, essentially. But ultimately, the musicians will determine whether the quality is good or not. And the other question is, sometimes you have an orchestra who is not very strong in a hall that's designed for large, strong orchestras, and they may not perform well in that specific space. And then you might have an orchestra like the Berlin is renowned to play very strongly, very confidently, and you need a hall that can support that. So when they came for the opening, you know, we started with a very small volume that is not designed for a Berliner. We increased to accommodate somebody, an orchestra like that, of that caliber. But I was nervous, you know, I was quite nervous just to think, you know, will it work? And it worked. I think they gave us very good feedback, and they were very positive about it. But that first moment of the rehearsal, I was a bit nervous.
Max Fain, artistic director of Andermatt Music and founder of the New Generation Festival, is here too.
In the creation of an acoustic and in the creation of a concert hall, to be here at the original tuning of the hall is something that every musician could dream of. And I think they've done the most incredible job, both in creating a natural acoustic and in this extended electroacoustic system, which gives great versatility to the hall, from solo performance to chamber to full orchestras, which was the ultimate ambition.
For Christina Seilern, there's been joy in creating a new cultural and civic building in the country of her birth, a country where quality counts.
There is this tradition of quality and slow decision making, right? You sometimes want to kill yourself about this slow decision making, but it's the important part of the process, because it's not just snap decision making. Understanding the psyche and understanding how it all works, and this is true not just for Switzerland, for every job that we do abroad, to really understand how a country operates or the mentality works is very important, and we have to adapt to that rather than the other way around of saying, we come from London and we know it all. We don't know it all. We have to go through this learning curve of operating regionally in another place, and I think it's crucial that we adapt and that we bring something else, right? Otherwise, we're not trying to be Swiss architects or Egyptian architects or whatever, so that we bring our own flavor, but we do have to adapt to however the country works or thinks. I find it incredible that an Egyptian is the one that reconnected me to Switzerland, because I grew up there. I was born there. I went to school there, and then I left at 18 and never went back. But I grew up in the mountains, so all of that is very, very familiar to me. And it was wonderful to be able to come back and work there and then interact with them. I'd done other projects in Switzerland, but I think they have such a sense of quality. There's a very, very strong sense of civic pride.
So Christina Seilern, the globetrotter, says, "I belong everywhere and I belong nowhere." Working with new cultures excites her. She's been through good times and bad. And now she can see the funny side of the day her university tutor handed out a small book to new students, which contained 100 reasons why you shouldn't become an architect.
I think that was the silliest part of it all. It was called Why Be an Architect, but there was only one reason, which was a passion of it or something, and then there were 100 reasons why not to be an architect, and they're all true. They're all true, but I think if you have the passion and if you actually manage to break through the necessary grind of the learning curve, drawing the same line 50 times until you have it right is part of the process. And sometimes I remember being like that, but I see the younger people in the office going, "Oh my God, I've got to redraw this entire thing." And I go, "Yeah, and another 20 times, and let me promise you that." So it's just sort of, there is an element of repetitiveness and this very slow process of research, which is very necessary. But once you see that line being poured in concrete on site, that's the moment when you actually understand why and why you're an architect. You don't do it as a business, you do it as a calling, I guess.
Next time, the award-winning Swedish architect Magnus Strom specialises in a very particular type of private house. Low-slung, clean lines, huge windows that bring the outside in. They remind you of the case study houses in America in the 1940s, or the Farnsworth House in Chicago, the genius of Mies van der Rohe, or the mid-century modern houses in England that are now listed and treasured. They need a good setting, space, a backdrop of trees, near to water, preferably with their own boathouse and landing stage. In many ways, a typical Scandinavian scene. But this house is not in Sweden. It's on the Isle of Wight.
You have something that's crafted and designed, it's going to last the test of time, and I think the same thing comes to architecture. We want to design things that last and have a longevity and that can age gracefully.
In these clean-lined boxes, how does the architect keep control of the look and feel, of the details, the furniture, as the mid-century masters did? By presenting a vision. Here, working quietly on England's south coast, is an architect who's harnessed the art of architecture in its most up-to-date form to his quest to design the perfect house.
I can't see why you can't combine something old and something new in a respectful way. Just because something is contemporary doesn't mean it have to be outrageous.